Thank you all for coming to the Red Circle. We pride ourselves as being the least scholarly and probably most social of the many Sherlockian societies. John Bennett Shaw said that the one thing that real Sherlockians take seriously is not taking themselves seriously. So we do our best. And I want to thank our official second videographer, because our normal videographer, Matt Hall, is not here. So thank you, Bev Wallach. Who is recording this for posterity, and our website.
And blackmail.
Now, Alan Reddick has passed out little flyers that everybody should have one. Alan, where are you?
Right here.
Tell them about it.
Oh, it's, I've been compiling all of the videos that we've been accumulating from our meetings and our Zoom meetings and miscellaneous other little things that happen. And I've been putting them up on our website, but then it occurred to me, it's also just as easy to do a YouTube channel. So I did a YouTube channel, and you have the listing of everything that's on the channel right now, and we'll add more as we go along.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, the real order of business is our guest speaker. Now, Ira Brad Matetsky really needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. He's the final problem in the Baker Street Irregulars, and the lawyer whose name was given in the paper in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and a New York City Sherlockian whose interest includes publication and bibliographical history of the canonical manuscripts, law, and the canon, Sherlockian society, history, and tradition, and the Doylean and Sherlockian poetry. His articles has appeared in the Baker Street Journal, 8 BSI Press books, and numerous other publications. He edited the BSI Press manuscript series volume, That Ghastly Face. It wasn't about me. And co-edited Upon the Turf, Horse Racing in the Sherlockian Canon. He received the BSI's Marley Montgomery Award in 2020 for his Baker Street Journal article, Another Sherlockian Myth Debunked, Time to Turn Page Pageant. Now, in addition to the Baker Street Irregulars and the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, he's a member of many Sherlockian societies, including, among others, Sons of the Copper Beeches, the Sherlockians of Baltimore, Six Napoleons, and of course, the Red Circle. He also chairs the Wolf Pack, the literary society for the Nero Wolfe Societies written by Rex Stout. And Ira is the longest serving member of the English Wikipedia Arbitration Committee. He's a regular contributor to and former canonical annotations editor of the Baker Street Almanac, and a frequent presenter at Sherlockian conferences. Now, in his spare time, he's practiced law in New York since 1987, and we're delighted to have him at today's luncheon. Please welcome Ira Brad Matetsky.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for the round of applause, almost as much as the Spumoni got. Peter mentioned that this is probably the least scholarly Sherlockian science, so of course he thought of me to come and give a talk. And I'm going to talk. I asked Peter, I'd be happy to come and talk. What would you like me to talk about? He said, about 15 minutes. But he allowed it to me to choose my topic. And the topic I've chosen, since this is the Washington, D.C. area BSI Science Society, I'm going to talk to you about Sherlock Holmes and Washington. And I'm not going to talk, other than very briefly right now, about the film Sherlock Holmes in Washington. It's a nice movie. We've all seen it. It was screened here at a theater a few years ago. It's available on whichever streaming service it's on at any given time. And you may enjoy it, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about Sherlock Holmes the canonical Sherlock Holmes in Washington and Arthur Conan Doyle in Washington. And we begin, as we should always begin, with the canon. Is Washington mentioned in the Sherlock Holmes stories? And the answer is Washington is mentioned once. Does anybody recall where? Stumped the band on the first try. Very nice. In the
Naval Treaty?
No, in the Valley of Fear, when McMurdo, aka Bertie Edwards, is explaining what he's been up to, he tells the boss and some of the others, he says, how he's been working undercover. He says, "I've had 3 months of it. I wouldn't have 3 more such months if they let me loose in the treasury in Washington." So that is Sherlock Holmes in Washington. Thank you very much. When did Sherlock Holmes first come to Washington? Well, there may have been some pirated copies of The Sign of Four in Washington in 1890. Lippincott's magazine featuring The Sign of Four was probably on sale somewhere in Washington or the Washington, D.C. area. But the first instance I've been able to prove of Sherlock Holmes coming to Washington was in the Washington Post on July 12th of 1891. July 12th of 1891 was the day on which the Washington Post published in newspaper form A Scandal in Bohemia, the first of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. The stories that were later collected in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes appeared in the United States in the newspapers. It was carefully arranged that they not appear before July 1st of that year, because that's when the new copyright treaty between the U.S. and the U.K. took effect. The first appearance anywhere in the United States was that weekend in newspapers around the country, some on the 11th, some on the 12th. The 11th was Saturday, the 12th was Sunday. And The Scandal in Bohemia appeared in the Washington Post on July 12th. I was hoping to bring the copy to show you. I have not been able to locate a copy of that newspaper for sale anywhere. If any of you happen to have it in your collection, please bring it to the next meeting. The Washington Post continued to run many of the stories that appeared in the first series of 12, Red-Headed League, Case of Identity, and so forth. Another place that you might find references to some of those stories in Washington, D.C. is in the Copyright Office. In order to take advantage of the now available copyright for a British subject in an American publication, of course it needed to be deposited with the Copyright Office. You needed to provide them with 2 copies, fill out a form, and pay a registration fee of $1. If one goes and looks up the copyright registration for A Scandal in Bohemia, it is not there. After Conan Doyle actually was part of lobbying for copyright protection, and after A.P. Watt went to such lengths to make sure that the story would be published to be eligible they forgot to send it in. And if you look at the early pirate editions, if you look at Glenn Marenker's catalog for a while, you'll see a lot of copies of A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four, because they were published before copyright protection became available. And you'll see copies of A Scandal in Bohemia and The Red-Headed League and a couple of the early stories because they forgot to get copyright protection or messed up the particulars. Later on, you do see the copyright entries, and you see them in an American form. Some of the titles are messed up. For example, one of the newspapers published The Noble Bachelor. They didn't call it The Noble Bachelor. If you look in the Washington Post, you'll just find The Adventure of the Bachelor. Whether this was a typing error or whether they decided Americans would not be interested in British nobility, I don't know. But if you look up the story in the copyright records, you will find merely The Adventure of the Bachelor, and that's because that's how it was registered. So there's all kinds of information you can find in those records. The next reference to Sherlock Holmes or Arthur Conan Doyle in Washington, D.C. that I'm going to reference is in 1894. 1894, to put this in context, Arthur Conan Doyle has just published The Final Problem, and disposed as he thinks of Sherlock Holmes. He wants to be talking, and he comes and gives a very well-known American lecture tour, which has been written about extensively. And one of his stops is Washington, where he wants to talk about the White Company and the refugees and what he's going to write about in the future, and is annoyed by questions about Sherlock Holmes and tried to spend as little time on Holmes as he can. Conan Doyle appeared in November of 1894 at the, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Metzgerat Music Hall in Washington, D.C. That building is no longer standing. I'm not sure what is there now. The FBI headquarters is there now. Maybe we could turn it back into a music hall. And Conan Doyle gives a talk. And the headlines in the Washington Post read, Conan Doyle deduces. The famous novelist tells of his early struggles. Sherlock Holmes dead for good. And he goes on. And it's interesting that he says he's dead for good, because whenever I read or reread The Final Problem, I realize that Conan Doyle, whether consciously or subconsciously, left himself an out. It would have been very easy for him to have written, in Dr. Watson's voice, I stared sadly at the lifeless body of Sherlock Holmes with 3 bullet holes through the heart, and I was there when we buried him, and I said goodbye to the best and wise. He didn't do that, and there were some contemporary references that maybe he was hedging, but he did not hedge in this talk. He said, of the most popular of his own creations, this is according to the paper, Dr. Doyle spoke rather slightingly, and of course he was Dr. Doyle and not yet Sir Arthur. Dr. Doyle spoke rather slightingly. It is perhaps true, he said, that one pleasant gentleman who has been a very good friend to me has been treated rather scurvily. In fact, if I had killed a real man, I could have called down scarcely more popular indignation than when I killed Sherlock Holmes. The letters that rained in on me ranged from the funny to the pathetic. Some were bitter and vindictive, as though I had broken some criminal statute. People went so far as to write asking for photographs of Mr. Holmes at various ages, locks of his hair, and the like. But it was justifiable homicide. And when a man has been the hero of 26 stories, it is about time for him to get out before he outstays his welcome. He goes on to talk about how Joe Bell in Scotland was the original model for Sherlock Holmes. But he tries as much as he can to talk about his other work. And the article begins, if any of the people who think of the originator of Sherlock Holmes as a ferret-faced detective with a taste for literature and the word deduction written all over him, they would have been very much disappointed on seeing him as he appeared at Metzgerat's Hall last night. The doctor is a big, good-natured, not quite typical Englishman, but with the supposedly British characteristics of a broad accent, slight diffidence, and deliberateness of speech. The sort of man who is good and substantial to look at, and whom one might not mind knowing better. And so that, and this article, this long article about Doyle's talk, is available on the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, the ACD website. If you type in Washington, it will come up. Dr. Doyle remains in Washington and then will go on to Newark and Philadelphia. So that's 1904. Doyle came back at least one more time to Washington several decades later, and there's press coverage available of that as well. Conan Doyle appeared in a letter. Conan Doyle's name appeared in a letter that appeared in the Washington Post, or an article rather, that appeared in the Washington Post in August of 1914. It's called William Gillette Had Plans of British Embassy. You all, of course, know who William Gillette was. It says, William Gillette, the actor who was in London when war was declared, was under surveillance as a supposed spy because he had plans of the British Embassy in Paris in his possession. Only the intervention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle saved him from jail. The American actor had been stopping at a retired London hotel because of depleted funds. Detectives who broke into his room rummaged through his private papers and found the embassy plans. They were confident they had caught a German spy. Through the author of Sherlock Holmes, he explained the plans were part of the play Diplomacy, in which he was to appear here. So William Gillette was spared to go on to appear in the film we've seen and so forth by Conan Doyle. That appears in the paper. Now, Conan Doyle met, we all know, or most of us know, that several presidents of the United States have been fans of Sherlock Holmes, including Franklin Roosevelt, who became president only after Conan Doyle had died, including Harry Truman, who was president, after Conan Doyle was gone. But Theodore Roosevelt and Conan Doyle met several times. And in fact, there is a letter in the National Archives in the Library of Congress, from the secretary to Theodore Roosevelt to S.S. McClure, the publisher. It reads, "The President has heard that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle will soon be in this country and wishes me to ask if you know when he will be here and where he can be reached after his arrival." And they did in fact meet while FDR was president. 20 years later, when Conan Doyle wrote Memories and Adventures, his memoir he wrote about President Roosevelt, he had a quick, blunt wit which shows itself often in his metaphors. He spoke to me, I remembered, of someone who had a 9 guinea pig power brain, meaning not very bright. One of his entourage told me how the president had been awakened once to address some prairie folk at a wayside station. "They have come 60 miles to see you," said his secretary solemnly. "They would have come 100 to see a cat with 2 heads," said the ruffled president. Now, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, while running for his 3rd term, was shot and wounded, albeit obviously not fatally, by a would-be assassin. Letters of condolence and commiseration and wishes for speedy recovery came in from all over, and one of them came from Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt wrote back. He wrote, "Dear Dr. Doyle, many thanks for your kind measure of sympathy. As you know, a bullet wound is rather a serious thing, but all conditions seem to be favorable, and I hope in a few days we will be relieved from anxiety. Sincerely signed, Theodore Roosevelt." And when Conan Doyle quoted that in his memoirs, he wrote, "It is typewritten, but signed by his own hand. I do not think that a more brave and detached letter was ever written by a sufferer." And I compare that with a letter that I came across from Conan Doyle himself. This one happens to be at Yale, written in 1909, when Conan Doyle was suffering himself from a malady. It reads, "Windlesham, Crowborough, Suffolk, January 1909. My dear Mr. Meredith," I'm not sure who that was, "Dear Mr. Meredith, today I have been allowed for the first time to write a letter, and my first is to you, to tell you how touched I was by your kind thoughts. Indeed, when I read your letter, I felt it was worth all the pain. I was operated on for internal hemorrhoids, a minor operation, and yet attended, I am told, by more painful after effects than almost any other in surgery. I had a week of unbroken pain of an obscene and hateful description, but I learned the blessings of morphia. Surely it is an argument for design that an inert vegetable should produce that which is so absolutely needful for a suffering human. Now I can only complain of discomfort, which in a week or 2 will be a mere memory. Once again, thanks to you for your kind words at a bad time." So we compare Arthur Conan Doyle's suffering with that of Theodore Roosevelt having been shot. A man named Brian Pugh, has put together a chronology of where Arthur Conan Doyle was every day in his life. I don't think he has this letter, and I will be able to tell him we now know where Arthur Conan Doyle was in the middle of January 1909. Theodore Roosevelt, he goes on to say, was a good, hearty man who he was very glad to know. He concludes, "Of the German emperor, he said he was jealous of the king's dog at the funeral because he attracted the most notice. Altogether, Roosevelt was one of the raciest talkers I had ever met." So, Arthur Conan Doyle is in Washington. Sherlock Holmes was in Washington. McMurdo talks about Washington. What are the other things that one should know about Sherlock Holmes in Washington? The other thing one might want to know is the availability of all sorts of information that one can research in about Sherlock Holmes in the Washington area. You are blessed in this area with all sorts of repositories, and in particular with the Library of Congress. And among the collections at the Library of Congress are the papers of a man named Ken McCormick, who was an editor for about 35 years at Doubleday. Doubleday, which of course published the Doubleday collected edition of Sherlock Holmes, which had the rights to many of the stories, which took over from the Doran Company, which had published His Last Bow and the Casebook. And there was all sorts of correspondence in this McCormick collection about the background to publication of the Sherlock Holmes stories, ranging from letters they got from people who were suspicious. In one of the editions of the collected Sherlock Holmes, there were, in the premium edition, there were signature pages set in with signatures of Arthur Conan Doyle. And some of the signatures looked like a very young, vigorous man, and some of them more of an old, sickly man. And people were saying, some of these signatures must be forgery. And they had to painstakingly write back to everyone saying, no, we had sheets left over from earlier in his life where he signed, and then they're all legitimate. For those of you who know about Adrian Conan Doyle and Dennis Conan Doyle and the hard time they gave everybody, they brought out an edition of Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, the Armed Forces edition. Some of you may know those books. Why, comes the complaint from Dennis Conan Doyle, is the royalty non-existent? He probably didn't know about World War II and that these special editions were going to soldiers, sailors, Marines, Air Force men on lonely islands, where the only activity to avoid going mad with boredom is to read. And they convinced the Conan Doyles to not try and suppress the Armed Forces edition. The Sherlock Holmes short stories, an inexpensive edition as the Depression set in, when thousands of people had little food, little work, except them barely housed. These cheap editions were very popular with people who were trying to use their time well and stay above water. All this had to be explained to the Conan Doyles. A chapter on the Baring Gould Annotated that many of us grew up with and was our first introduction to the Sherlockian community. That book came so close to not happening so many times due to objections from different publishers and so forth. If you have these are all articles I hope to write someday, but if you ever get to Capitol Hill and have an afternoon, request a look at these papers. They're absolutely fascinating. There was a chapter in there, I'll close with this, on the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. Wasn't going to be published as the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. It was going to be titled Stories from Sherlock Holmes's Casebook. At the last minute, he changed the title. He also changed the order of the stories. If you've ever wondered why the stories in the Casebook are not in the order that they were published in, you have to go to the Library of Congress in Washington and look up the reason why. And so there are lots of connections I'm sure I've missed a few, between Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Washington, D.C. Of course, the best connection is the presence here of the Red Circle. Long may it continue, and continue to draw connections between Washington or the Washington area and Sherlock Holmes. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Ira?
Yes.
What were Ken McCormick's dates, birth, death dates? Do you know offhand? How long did he stay in publishing?
He was in publishing for about 35 years. The files range from the late 20s to the late 60s. A few of the files at the very beginning he had inherited from a predecessor, but he must have been active for at least 35 or 40 years, because he is clearly on top of what's going on. I mean, there's two full archival boxes of these permission requests, negotiating with the Conan Doyles, negotiating with A.P. Watt. A.P. Watt was the first professional literary agent in England, and Conan Doyle was one of his clients, so that makes Watt the literary agent's literary agent. And lots of correspondence with him, all sorts of fascinating. You would think that Arthur Conan Doyle, particularly with respect to Sherlock Holmes, has been studied, I don't want to say to death, but that everything there is to know would be known by now. And it is remarkable how, if one rolls up one's sleeves and digs into the archives, how much more information is out there. I've come across the Harper papers, the Harper Brothers papers at Columbia, the A.P. Watt papers at North Carolina, these papers at Washington. It is astonishing how much more information is out there. I have to be careful sometimes because the details of this publication history are a little bit of a niche interest. And Christopher Morley famously said about the first series of the Baker Street Journal, never has so much been written by so many for so few. And I don't mind writing for so few, but I want to make sure that there's any audience at all. Sometimes I think that for some of my articles, the audience is about 8 people and 7 are deceased. So one has to pick one's spots. Yeah.
Follow-up, how did you become interested in doing this particular kind of minute, data-driven research? Has this always been something part of your life? I mean, I know you from various walks of life besides Conan Doyle as being very fascinated with this sort of kind of arcane work.
The question, I don't know if it's being picked up on the tape, is how I got interested in some of these arcane details, and the answer is there is something wrong with me. No, this particular, it's actually Ross Davies who unfortunately had to leave. He'll see this on the tape. About 10 years ago, he started. He published an issue of his Greenbag Almanac, which was the predecessor of the Baker Street Almanac that comes out every year. And he said, "Would you like to write an article?" And I said, as I jokingly said earlier, what should I write about? But I was serious. I said, "What would you like me to write about?" And so, being a professor, he assigned me a research problem. And the research problem was this: the first series of Sherlock Holmes stories in the Adventures, and then the second series in what were later titled the Memoirs, were published in 2 places at once in the United States. They were published in mass market periodicals, the first series in the newspapers, the second series in Harper's Weekly, but they also came out simultaneously in the American edition of the Strand magazine, which existed going back to 1891, when the British edition of the Strand also started, but in much more limited quantities at first. And he said, why would either of these publications allow pretty much simultaneous publication in the other? And so I did some delving into the early publication history, trying to answer this question. It turned out that the great Sherlockian Bliss Austin had asked the very same question about 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier in an article in the Baker Street Miscellanea. Fortunately, he had never gotten around to answering the question. And so that was what got me started on this particular niche area of research. But one of the things I love about being a Sherlockian, at least the way I do it, is that this is not one hobby. This is about 15 hobbies. Because I could spend, if I call my girlfriend tonight and she said, "What'd you do?" and I say I did some Sherlock Holmes related things, it could mean giving a talk. It could mean going to a library and doing some scholarly research. It could be when I'm asked to do a toast at a Sherlockian meeting, knowing that I like to talk a lot and I want to keep it to a 2 or 3 minute length, I'll write a poem because I'm not going to ad-lib 3 extra stanzas. So writing silly poetry. Or at next week's Priory Scholars meeting, I was asked to do the plot summary for the story. I do those in song parody. Very different kind of presentation from what I'm doing now. Then the BSI weekend, of course, is held in New York, and when the Roosevelt Hotel, where many of you have stayed, closed down, and I happen to live in Midtown Manhattan, so I got a call from Michael Keane, and he said, "Would you please find us another hotel and negotiate a contract with the hotel. And so now I'm negotiating, room contracts. This is a long way away from, I really like these stories. This was as the pandemic was winding out, and I had to find out which hotels were even going to be open by that time, much less available. If it were still possible to send a telegram, I would have telegraphed to Michael, who would have said, visited 22 hotels as directed. There were so many things. As Peter read, I'm a lawyer in my day job, so I'll write about legal aspects of the stories. I'll think about, I happen to enjoy Arthur Conan Doyle's poetry. I think I may be the only one. It's lots of fun. So the Arcanum is not all of it, but it's a piece I enjoy, and it's a piece many of you enjoy. One more question over here, if there's time.
I thought you should add to your repertoire that you gave a Sherlockian poem at a Lewis Carroll meeting.
I did give a Sherlock. I had written when the Priory scholars read The Dying Detective about 6 years ago, and I was asked to give a toast. And so, as we all know, one of the highlights of The Dying Detective, as all of you who are SPODE members know, is Sherlock Holmes's mock delirious reference to the oysters. And so I wrote a poem parodying The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll. What I did not know was that Bob Steck, who was at that meeting, is also an officer of the Lewis Carroll Society. And so I and three other Sherlockians who had also done some Lewis Carroll related thing were subpoenaed to a Lewis Carroll Society meeting and required to present our poetry there as well. Any more questions? If not, one more. Yes.
How many of the casebook stories are now in the public domain?
All.
All. Okay.
After the last of the extensions, the copyright term was 95 years, and the last story appeared in 1927. So the last casebook stories went into the public domain in the United States on January 1st of 2023. Conan Doyle lived for 3 more years after that, wrote a number of other stories, and so his very last stories that came out during his lifetime will go into the public domain on December 31st of this year. If any of you were looking to publish the complete Professor Challenger or the full collected short stories of Conan Doyle, at the end of this year is your chance.
Okay.
Bravo.
Thank you.